Thank you all for coming out tonight, and a special thank you to Jack Weatherford for being here this evening. And as you can tell with the cameras, we have a special taping tonight for C-SPAN's Book TV. So we will run this as we usually do. Jack will speak for about 20 minutes to a half an hour, and then he'll take your questions. And then if you want your book signed, we'll take care of all that after the question and answers. And my name is Kim, and I am the events coordinator here at Bound to be Read. So I will do a little introduction for Jack, and then we will let him come up here. So Professor Weatherford is a cultural anthropologist who has been teaching anthropology at Macalester College since 1983. He graduated from the University of South Carolina with a BA in political science and received an MA in sociology from the University of South Carolina also. Soon after, he went back for an MA in anthropology. In 1977, he received his PhD in anthropology from the University of California, in San Diego. He further went on to get a postdoctoral degree in policy studies from Duke University Institute of Policy Sciences. Since then, Dr. Weatherford has worked with contemporary groups in places such as Bolivia and the Amazon. He's also worked with historical analyses such as the impact of the American Indians on world history. In recent years, he has concentrated on the Mongols by looking at their impact since the time that Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes in 1206. The result being his new book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Professor Weatherford has also appeared on radio and television programs including The Today Show, ABC Evening News with Peter Jennings, Larry King, All Things Considered, and The Voice of America, as well as international programs from Bolivia to Mongolia. He is the author of several books, including The History of Money, Savages and Civilization, Who Will Survive, which is on the contemporary clash of world cultures, Indian Givers, How the Indians of the Americas Transformed the World, and Native Roots, How the Indians Enriched America. Dr. Weatherford's books have won the Minnesota Book Award in 1989 and 1992. He also received the 1992 Anthropology in the Media Award from the American Anthropological Association, and he received the 1994 Mass Media Award of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Please welcome Professor Jack Weatherford. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much, Kim. I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone coming out tonight here in beautiful St. Paul, Minnesota, to talk about a place that's very, very far away and yet in some ways quite similar to here. We're all familiar with cold in Minnesota, and Mongolia is the home of cold. I think it's sort of like Minnesota except at a much higher altitude. What I'd like to do tonight, though, is begin our story. It's a long time ago. It's 800 years ago. It's way back in the 1100s. It was a much different place in the world, especially in Central Asia. And to begin the story in a very remote place, even within Central Asia, even within Mongolia, a very remote place. It's a small river, the Onan River, that flows out of Mongolia into Siberia. It's a river where not much has happened in the history of the world. But back at this particular time, it was a springtime, back around the year 1170 or so, a woman was left alone. A woman who had 5 children, a woman who had been kidnapped, who had been taken against her will. She was left alone because the tribe no longer had food to feed her. They no longer had a means to take care of her. And her eldest son at this time was 8 years old. He was going to become Genghis Khan. At this time, he was just a young boy, Temüjin, just a young kid, an 8-year-old. And suddenly to have in your life something occur that's so traumatic, to have your entire family thrown out to die. The clan could not support her because her husband was dead. No other man would marry her. And the tribe had to move on. As the tribe left her behind, she grabbed up the emblem of her husband. It's a stick that had the horse hair tied onto it from all of the horses that he had ever had in his life. And in Mongolian history, this was the banner of that man. This was his soul after he died. She grabbed it up and she raced after the people, and she raced around them, and she so shamed them that they returned only until dark. And then in the cover of darkness, they left her and her 8 children to die. It's from this beginning that our story originates, because this woman, Erlun, the woman who was taken against her will to live in this place by a man who had kidnapped her and then died, this woman ran up and down the river, as the story says, night and day. She pulled her hat down on her head, she tied up her skirt, she took a juniper stick, and she ran up and down the river in order to dig roots, in order to find something to fill, in the words of the ancient poets, to fill the gullet of her brood. And she did it, somehow against all odds, against every imaginable odd. She managed to survive, and she protected every one of her children, and they survived. This boy, Temüjin, was going to grow up to become Genghis Khan. He had a life not just of poverty, not just in a remote place, but as an outcast, an absolute outcast from everyone and everything. And soon after the survival of these children, he was taken as a slave by another tribe. And from this position of outcast and then slave, he slowly began to assemble a life for himself. It's very hard to imagine what kind of life he was going to assemble. But there was a girl whom he met, a young girl, and in the Mongolian tradition, as often happened, just slightly older than he was. Her name was Berta. He met her, and it said that from the beginning that there was fire in her eyes and light in her face, and that he fell in love with her. And as a teenager, she came to live with him, probably around 16 years old or so. He would have been around 16, I imagine, and she was probably around 17 years old. She came to live with him. And you can just imagine, perhaps in this lonely, lonely place, somebody who has never had a life, somebody who has lived as an outcast and a slave, never had anything good in this world, the poorest of the poor. They ate whatever scraps of food they could find, and now he has something good in his life. One good thing, Berta. She loves him, he loves her, and after only a few months, she is kidnapped away from him. A tribe comes. They're all sleeping in the tent in the ger early in the morning, and there were several people in the family. There were the boys, there was one young daughter, there was the mother, there was another woman who had taken refuge with the family. This little family of outcasts. They were sleeping, and as sometimes happens, some of the older people are half awake, half asleep, and this older woman, they called her grandmother Kwakchin, she was half asleep and half awake, lying on the floor, and she felt the vibrations. She felt somewhere, as it said, she had ears like a weasel, and she felt the vibrations in the earth, and she warned them that someone was coming. They fled. They fled, and of course they had to leave her behind, because Berta was the prize that the attackers were seeking. And Erlun, the mother who had pulled these children through so much, she knew what she had to do to save her children, and that is she had to leave this other younger woman behind, and she did it. So here's Temüjin now. He's had a horrible life up to this age of 16 or so. Something good happens for a short period of time, and now who will he be? What will he be? Will he fight? Will he look for another wife? Will he go to some other place to live? What will he do? He flees to the mountains, he goes, and he prays. For several days he stays alone and he prays. And at the end, Temüjin decided that even though he was an outcast, even though he had no allies in the world, even though his own clan had deserted him and there was no one to fight for him, he would fight anyway. He would go after Berta. He did not want to live without her. This is the beginning of the story. It's a beginning because in order to get her back, and it's going to take a long time, many months, before he can get her back, he must first go and find allies, people who will fight for him. And slowly, bit by bit, one by one, he assembles a coalition through the coming months. He goes back and finds everybody he's ever had contact with in his life. He goes to everyone his father had had contact with in his life. He searches out for people who might help him. And now, he has made that irrevocable step into the politics of Inner Asia. Now he can never go back to being an outcast. Now he will have enemies who will be permanent enemies. Now he will be a part of feuds. He will be a part of raids. It'll be a long life of fighting. And this began for him at age more or less 16. He was born around the year 1162. His father died around 1170. He'd been left behind, so now we're up until around 1178 or something like that. And he begins a struggle to fight off the enemies around him one by one and to unite with potential allies one by one that will take him to the year 1206 before he has finally brought peace to the steppes of Inner Asia. A long, slow process. He will grow old fighting these wars in Inner Asia. But then I want to fast forward for a moment. We see this beginning, but now let's go to later in life. Go to year 12, 22, 23. He's now a man pushing age 60. He's in Afghanistan. He has conquered everything that he ever touched. After the long struggle to unite the tribes of Central Asia, then he turned their attention on the civilizations that harassed him. Because at first, it seemed only to him that the fighting was about women and about goods. But gradually he realized that the raiding and feuding in the steppes was often caused by the civilized people who pitted one tribe against another, who played off one group against another. And he turned then his attention to them. He conquered the north of China. He took in Korea. He conquered Central Asia. Then he went to Afghanistan. He enjoyed Afghanistan. But he was a man now in his twilight of his years. He was now a man in his 60s who had to think very carefully about what would happen to this world that he had fought in for so long. And he had 4 sons. And he realized, as we sometimes do at a certain age in life, that sometimes maybe we have conquered so much, we have done so much in one sphere of life, and then maybe in other spheres of life we didn't do what we should have done. And for this man, Temüjin, Genghis Khan, he now realized that his 4 sons weren't up to the task. What would he do with these 4 sons? How would he train them? He set out all kinds of military exercises for them in Central Asia. He sent them off in pairs and singly and in all kinds of combinations to learn how to be leaders in warfare. He would go back over the battlefield with them and show them how they should have done this and should have done that and rethink the whole strategy. He brought in sages and wise men from China, from India, from the Muslim world, from all over to have long discussions and dialogues. In fact, we are grateful to those people, at least, that they went away, as presidential advisors often do, and they wrote up their memoirs, which mostly consisted of saying how it's amazing that this man got so far in life without me, and had he listened to me more, he would have gotten much farther. But it all failed. It all failed. It was too late. His boys had been reared in a different world from the one in which Genghis Khan had been reared. They didn't learn the lessons that he had learned because they didn't experience them. So he, instead of relying solely upon his sons to carry on the mission, he recognized that it had to be put into law, that his way of doing things and the system that he wanted to create, it had to be codified into law. And so he created what's known as the Great Law. It was not supposed to replace the laws of the individual countries and civilizations and tribes. They could still have their own law, but above that there must be a higher law. And that's why they called it the Great Law. And the Great Law began with a very simple law, and that is that it was forbidden to kidnap women. If we look back at the history, if we don't know the life of the person who instituted this, we can imagine all kinds of things. It's forbidden to kidnap women. Well, maybe he was a feminist, or we might guess that he was forward-thinking, or there are many things. He had an ideological bent for some reason. But once we understand the details of his life, then we begin to understand where this law came from. He had recognized in the life of his mother and in the life of his wife what happened when women were kidnapped. It wasn't just a crime against one person. It was a crime against everyone in the community. Her children suffered. Her kinspeople suffered. For generations on, they would suffer. So he changed that law. You could not kidnap women, and as a corollary to that, you could not buy or sell women. His life was a very pragmatic life, a very simple life. And yet, through learning the experiences of his life, he was able to create a new vision. We only remember him as a conqueror today, the greatest conqueror in the history of the world. As my students get tired of hearing me say over and over and over, I'm sure. But the greatest conqueror, no one comes close. You think about people such as Alexander the Great, his whole empire would be one province in the empire of Genghis Khan. The Roman Empire, just one district in the empire of Genghis Khan, the greatest conqueror in the history of the world. So once we put that aside, then we go on to look, what else did he do? Well, he not only created an empire, he created an empire that survived his death. Napoleon did not do that. Alexander the Great did not do that. Genghis Khan did that. It survived him by about 150 years. And it was an empire that looked forward to the future in the way that it was organized and set up. Not merely in the fact that women could not be kidnapped, but in many other aspects, such as total religious freedom. Total religious freedom. Exactly what that says, total. That means you could worship anyone you wanted, have any scripture you wanted. You had to bow down before no Mongol god, no Mongol concept, no Mongol scripture. Not like in the Roman Empire where you had to worship the leader of the country, and then after that you could worship your own gods. No, in the Mongol Empire you could worship as you pleased. And again, this came to Genghis Khan not through ideological means, not through just figuring out things and looking to the future. It came from the study of life around him. He recognized that just as the kidnapping of women created great problems for the tribes and the clans of Inner Asia, it was religious strife that created the greatest problems for the civilizations around them, for Christians and Muslims, for Muslims and Buddhists. The first people whom he liberated, and I use the word liberated, the first people whom he liberated after uniting the steppe tribes were Muslims who were suffering under a Buddhist tyrant. And he liberated those people at their request, and they then became faithful followers of his throughout the rest of the history of the empire. They were the Uyghur people. He created religious freedom because he recognized that that was a way that people could have peace with one another. He also recognized that every religion, just like every tribe, just like every civilization, had something to offer the world. In the words of his grandson, Khan, who was the most capable of all of his grandsons, Khan, when being questioned by a priest from Europe, said that the religions of mankind are like the different fingers of God, and everyone has its own use. And that was the Mongol perspective throughout their history. The other thing that he did that was so unusual was he declared that all envoys of any country, of any ruler, at any time, were sacred envoys of peace. They could never be harmed, they could never be imprisoned, they could never be killed. You have to think about the world that we're living in now. 800 years ago, in the 1200s, envoys were mostly hostages. Hostages sent to a distant court, and the way you usually declared your displeasure with another country was to kill the hostages that were sent. You killed the envoys. That was a civilized way of doing things. Genghis Khan recognized that in order to have peaceful relations, you had to have the sanctity of envoys. You had to have diplomatic immunity. The list of laws goes on and on for Genghis Khan. What he created in his lifetime, to this day, in some regards, has not been fulfilled. It was a dream or an ideal of how government should be, how the world should be, that we still have not been able to fulfill. But the most important symbol to me is that when Genghis Khan was born, no one in China so far as we know, had ever been to Europe. No one in Europe, so far as we know, had ever been to China. By the time he died, China and Europe were in constant, perpetual contact that has not been broken until this day. He united the regional civilizations of the world into one economic system, into one political system for much of Eurasia, into a system based on an international law that's still superior to many of the laws that we have in many of the parts of the world today, a law that outlawed torture, something we haven't been able to do to this day, a law that was far more forward-looking than many of us can now imagine. Genghis Khan was born on this river to a woman who had been kidnapped. He survived to unite the tribes of Central Asia. He went on to conquer the largest empire in the history of the world. Was his life a success? Well, as a conqueror, yes. You have to say yes. His empire survived. As a lawgiver, depends on how we look at it. In terms of the laws that he made, yes, his thinking was successful. His formulation of legal concepts was successful. But of course, the enactment of those laws did not take place. The world today has not come to appreciate those laws that he gave the world. So in that regard, he didn't succeed as he might have wanted. And his sons. Well, sometimes at the end, maybe that's what's the most important, is the son, the daughters, the family itself. How about them? He failed. He failed. The eldest son had been born to him just after he brought Berta back from captivity. Just after. She had been married off to another man in captivity. And when that child was born, he gave that child the name Juch, and he said, "This is my son." But other people didn't recognize it. Other people said, "No, this is the child. This is a bastard child of the Merkit people who had kidnapped her." Even his own other sons wouldn't accept this one. The second son, well, the second son was resentful. He thought he was the first son, and he should have the responsibility and the power and the prestige and the respect. And so this son became, well, a little more rigid. He became very deeply steeped in the laws of the Mongol people. He became a fanatical Mongol in some ways, but without the flexibility of his father, without the ability to adapt and to change. The third son, well, the third son drank a lot. He was the most popular because he was drunk the most. And so then he was going to inherit from the father in the end. It is said of Genghis Khan, the third son, that the father complained to the other boys about his drinking. And so the boys went to him and talked to him, and they explained that he had to stop some of the drinking. And he said, okay, he would only drink 1 cup of fermented mare's milk a day. And then the Mongols are a very literal people. If they give their word, they will keep their word. They're always honest, always exact, always precise. And so the story goes that he then had a cup made large enough to last the whole day. I don't believe that story. It's not true, but yet many false stories carry some information that is true. And that was that he did have a drinking problem. And the fourth son also died drunk in a drunken stupor. So within his own family, with his sons, to a certain degree he failed. His grandsons, some did better. One of them, Mongol Khan, was a great lawgiver and a great leader. Kublai Khan, who became the great Khan, who became more a leader of China than of the Mongols, that's still debated to this day. Some people think he was the greatest of all the descendants, and some people think that he was the worst. I think that is a discussion that will go on for some time in history, the evaluation of him. In the end, what was the importance of Genghis Khan? Most people in the world gave him no importance. Everyone whom he had conquered looked upon him as a barbarian. The Chinese, the Muslims, both Arabs and Persians and other Muslims, certainly the Christians. All of them looked upon him as a barbarian from the steppe, a man who had been born in the wilds of the inner part of Mongolia, and it came out with his army and conquered people, destroyed cities. A barbarian. In the words of Genghis Khan, we don't have those words. He didn't write a biography. He didn't give us a book. He didn't let anyone erect a statue to him or build a monument or write books or poems or songs to him. There was just silence out of respect to him. And so the story was written by his enemies, by all these other people, the people whom he had conquered, the people who lived under his descendants. They wrote his story, and they wrote then the worst stories imaginable. They emphasized all the horrors. They neglected the good that he had done. And in time, the good was forgotten. Only a few people in history, very few, ever spoke up for the reputation of Genghis Khan. But I think it's very important to look at who some of those people were. Geoffrey Chaucer, first writer in the English language. The first book, the Canterbury Tales, calls Genghis Khan the greatest lord that ever lived. Well, Geoffrey Chaucer wasn't just a romance writer. Geoffrey Chaucer had spent much of his life as a diplomat for the King of England throughout Europe, but especially in France and in Italy. He knew about diplomacy. He knew about international relations. And he judged Genghis Khan the greatest lord that ever lived. But by the time we get to the Enlightenment in European history, people have forgotten about his greatness. He's just now a symbol of the barbarian Mongol hordes. All of those words, just think about horde itself, a word that means court in Mongolian, the court. It became a derogatory term in the West. The very names of Mongol, Tartar, Tatar, all of these became insults in the West. And then when the races were assigned by scientists in the 19th century, then the Mongol name was given to all the Asian races and the American Indian races, and everything that wasn't either European or African became then Mongol. But then if the European race is supposed to be the superior one and the Mongols are inferior, then they asked the great scientific minds of the 19th century, how is it that they had retarded children? They said, it must be because of the rape of the Mongols when they came through Europe. And so they even labeled these children as Mongols, the Mongoloids. History has not been kind to Genghis Khan and the Mongol people. The Mongol people have given the world much. They have inspired the world to a higher level of idealism in the laws of Genghis Khan. They have brought the world to a new level, and yet the world ignores them. Mongolia today, a very small nation in terms of population, still rather isolated from the rest of the world. Mongolia today is struggling to find its way into the world system. The world system that started there in Mongolia. Started when this woman, Erlun, picked up the spirit banner of her husband and chased after the people who were deserting her and her children. And when she was deserted, she pulled them through. The Mongol people are still there. Her children are still alive because of what she did. Thank you very much for listening to my comments on Genghis Khan and Mongolian history. I'd like to open it up now so that we can have a discussion and an interaction. Now you have the gist of my beliefs, and I am always open to questions, to corrections, and to criticisms. Yes, sir.
What made him such a great military leader? Tactics that he would use in combat that would bring victory to him over his rivals.
Yes, the military abilities of Genghis Khan are amazing. And I think it's very difficult as we look back just in the historical record to figure it out. I think my greatest good fortune in going to Mongolia was going at a time when the homeland where Genghis Khan was born had just opened up after the withdrawal of the Soviets in the 1990s. So this land where he had been born and it was closed up was suddenly available to go into. Also, a secret history of the Mongols that had been lost for a very long time. It was found in the 19th century in a coded version. It was finally decoded in the 20th century. In the 1980s, Harvard University published that in English. So I was very fortunate to go at a time when we had this document available and the homeland was open. And then some things began to become quite clear very fast. And that is, contrary to our image of Genghis Khan, and most foreign writers and chroniclers even of the time had described him really as a person of the steppe. And his army was from the steppe, but his early life was spent in a wooded area. And because he had been abandoned as a child, and most of that story was not known, his background, because he didn't allow things to be written about him, it was simply unknown, most of the things that had happened to him. But it became very clear that once he was abandoned and the animals that his family had were also taken from them at that time, he grew up really as a forager in a hunting environment where people would gather and hunt. And it is clear from the description of his mother and how she ran up and down the river that that's what they were doing. So then if you look at the tactics that he used and you compare that with the hunting tribes of that area, you begin to see how he was treating warfare much more like a hunting expedition. And he adapted many of those techniques that the Mongols, for example, would go into a wooded area, spread out, as many tribal people in the world have done, make a lot of noise in order to drive animals towards a central point. And then, of course, they would go in then and harvest those animals at the end of this long hunt. And those, in the longest cases, they could even take 3 months of doing this in order to get as many animals as possible. But when he was alone with his family, of course, it was much smaller. But we find that he does the exact same thing when he invades an area, that he starts at the outermost edges. Rather than going straight for the big city at the heart, he started at the edge and he would drive people towards the center. So that would disrupt everything that's going on. The villages would be abandoned, people would take refuge in the city, it would cause more problems in the city, and the city itself would begin to break down. You can follow step by step, even with the words that they use. It's an exact adaptation of hunting techniques. Then sometimes he would also use herding techniques on armies, but for the most part it was hunting.
How do you maintain a thread of political unity in an empire that stretches from literally the Pacific to the Mediterranean?
The great genius of the Mongols, I think, was in movement and communication. Genghis Khan never built a single building, palace, fortress, castle, anything like that, contrary to the times, but he spent all of his effort building communication systems. So he built bridges everywhere he went, he dug wells, he had stations set up much like the Pony Express. And so these stations allowed for the very rapid movement of information. It's said that the fastest message that ever traveled in the history of Eurasia up to that point was when word of the death of his son, Ogüde Khan, traveled from inner parts of Mongolia all the way to Hungary in about 4 to 6 weeks, which was just phenomenal at that time. But it was a communication system based on rapid movement, and he recognized the importance of information and movement. Now, the odd part about it all is that Genghis Khan did have a written language created. The Mongols did not have one, but in 1204, he had one created. That language, however, was only for the law and for the administration of the legal system. He appointed a Supreme Court justice, and then that justice was charged, the first one who could read and write, he was charged with writing down the decisions. He did not, however, allow the army to use written messages. Everything in the army had to be done orally because he felt that a message could betray him at any time, a written message, but he knew that a Mongol never would, no matter what happened. So this is one of the great unknown stories, and I only have a little bit of information about how this system worked. But you can imagine, you have messages that have to go all the way from Korea to Hungary, from Vietnam to Russia. How do you do that just with oral messages? And so the Mongols developed a highly sophisticated system of using poetry and song. So it was an empire that was strung together with poetry and with song that the military used in order to function. It's an amazing story, and it's not understood yet. But if you listen to Mongolian singing and music even to this day, you can begin to get some idea of how they are able to recreate landscapes in their song and in the way that they use the human voice in a way that I know of no other culture in the world. It's an amazing achievement, what the Mongols have done with song. Yes, please.
I'm curious as to what the local governance structures were in the areas that he conquered before he conquered them, because it seems that if there was a very strong tradition of local governance, that the empire would have collapsed as soon as the strong ruler had disappeared. And was it the legal system he created that prevented that, or was there little tradition of self-government in those areas?
People were allowed a certain amount of self-rule, so long as they remained loyal to the Mongols. And I think that did help. But the crucial part, I think, for why the empire stayed together was that everyone was benefiting. The common people everywhere felt some benefit from this system. Now today we only talk about the destruction because the Mongols did destroy. They destroyed cities that were impinging on the steppe, for example. They destroyed irrigation systems that came into the pasture land. But aside from that, once they had done that destruction of the things that were impinging on their world, they then offered protection to common people. They were most hated by the rulers because they killed the rulers wherever they went. Unlike other governments that often would sell rulers back and forth and take them hostage and allow for ransoming, Mongols never used hostage taking, never used ransoms of any sort. They killed the rulers, but then they gave common people a lot more voice in their lives. And the people benefited from the new trade that the Mongols sponsored. They benefited from the innovations of Mongol life. There was a tremendous support. If you think about the size of the Mongol people, after Genghis Khan created the Mongol nation, 1206, it was only about 1 million people. So even after he put everyone together in what they called the people of the felt walls, people who lived in the gers, the tents, or sometimes we call them yurts, after he put them together, there's only 1 million. And I point out that there are many corporations today that have more than 1 million workers in them. So it's quite small, and yet with 1 million people, he was able to rule an empire of hundreds of millions. His own army was only about 100,000. They could fit in a stadium today. So you cannot rule with that small a number over that large a number unless the people are supporting it in some way. And Genghis Khan had a genius for finding out what people wanted and at least satisfying that for some numbers of people. We already mentioned with the Uyghur people, giving them religious freedom. There were many other groups who were given certain types of freedom that made them then fiercely loyal to him.
How is he viewed today in Mongolia? Is he treated as a hero? Do they celebrate his birthday? Is there a monument or a special tomb or something?
There is no tomb. Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia in death to the same place where the stories along the Onan River had taken place. He returned there to be buried anonymously back in the Mongolian earth. No tomb, no monument, no statue, no, not even a tombstone, nothing. And all the Mongol rulers disappeared back into Mongolia. Many people today want to go searching for them, of course, because it's an enigma. How can it be that the greatest conqueror in the history of the world just disappeared back into the place where he was born? But Genghis Khan chose that. Now in Mongolia, throughout most of the history, he has been highly respected because he was the founder of the nation. During the socialist times, in the communist era of the 20th century, then under the rule, primarily the control of the Soviet Union, then the respect for Genghis Khan was discouraged. Everything about Genghis Khan was discouraged in Mongolia during those times. People could not talk about him or write about him. Almost nothing was published about him or said about him. In the year 1962, Mongolia had just been admitted into the United Nations 1 year earlier. And in 1962, it was the 800th anniversary of the birth of Genghis Khan. And some of the Mongolian people felt that they should recognize that event. And so under the leadership of one of their political leaders by the name of Temüjin, The Mongolian people, they issued 5 stamps, very simple stamps, to recognize his birth. They called a conference of academicians to come together to talk about him and his history. And then they appropriated some cement, just some cement, to send out to the countryside, a very long way from the capital, to the countryside, to make a small marker where he was born. This was a moment, however, when Russia and China were pulling apart. There were great tensions between the two, and here was Mongolia in the middle. Mongolia had joined the United Nations. There was a chance that the Mongolians might begin to see themselves as independent. Some people had said, why couldn't it be a neutral country like the Switzerland of Asia? The Russians were afraid that they would side perhaps with the Chinese. And so in retaliation for this very small gesture of respect for Genghis Khan, the Russians came in and they removed Temüjin from office. And then they sent him away, and later he was chopped up with an axe. And then the scholars were arrested. The scholars, some of them were sent into internal exile. Some of their children were put out into the streets, almost exactly as it happened to Erlun and her children 800 years earlier. Some of the children were put out into the streets to suffer whatever fate awaited them. And it was a horrible time of repression in Mongolia in the 1960s against the people who studied Genghis Khan. Earlier, the descendants had already mostly been killed in Mongolia, if they could be identified. Today, however, Mongolia is trying to find its way back to a correct understanding of their own history and their own background and their own connection to Genghis Khan. He is very much respected. Yes, ma'am.
I want to ask 2 things. One is, how did his brothers fare? And the other question is, you know, you see movies, were they really as cruel? Was everybody as terrified of the Mongols when they came roaring in their horses as you see in the movies?
How did the brothers of Genghis Khan fare?
Yes.
His brothers, for the most part, fared just fine. They survived. His second brother to him was a great archer, a very strong man. And so his full brothers all survived. Unfortunately, he had 2 half-brothers. One of those survived and became the longest living member of that family, named Belgatai. He was very, very famous in Mongolian history. He did very many brave deeds. The other brother, however, was killed by Genghis Khan himself when they both came into puberty. There were 2 half-brothers. Only one was going to dominate, and Genghis Khan was the one. So his brother Bektar was killed. That was your first question, was about the brothers.
About how cruel? Were people terrified when they came?
I think people are always terrified of any invader, and the Mongols did everything they could to increase terror when they attacked. They spread stories about themselves beforehand. They tried all kinds of tricks in order to get people to surrender without fighting. The Mongols fought to win. They did not fight by the same rules that the Europeans fought by. However, once the fighting was over, the Mongols never engaged in torture. That's one thing that was quite different about them. They used the terror before an attack to frighten people. But I think there's a good contrast with the Mongols and with other civilized people, in that in one battle that was lost there in Afghanistan during this time that I mentioned, that Genghis Khan was trying to teach his sons, and also he had adopted sons. All of these he was trying to teach how to fight. And in one case, one had made a very bad mistake, and a bunch of Mongols, a group of them, had been taken prisoner, which was quite unusual. But they were taken prisoner, and then the civilized people who took them prisoner paraded them through the city, and then took them into the center of the city and drove nails into their head in order to kill them in front of the other people of the city as a way of celebrating a triumph. Mongols never engaged in such activities. If anything, the Mongols had a real abhorrence of blood and of getting blood on them. They fought hard, but they fought from a distance. They shot with arrows primarily. They did not kill up close. They did not want to see the blood, much less to get the blood on them. Yes, sir.
A person who suffers or knows suffering, especially at an early age or the growing age, would be more likely to grow up to become a person of good principle, a person who can appreciate and recognize the important things in life, the more profound things. Would you say that Genghis and his story would perpetuate this idea, or do you think he was just an exception of this logical fallacy?
It's a good question, and I think the latter, to be honest. I think all of us, if we've ever suffered anything, we would like to think that suffering makes us better and makes us more noble and shows us the right way. But I don't think history bears that out. I think all too often when people have suffered and they get great power, they very often abuse it. And I think he is the exception in that he never gave in to a life of any kind of real pleasure or a life of any kind of luxury. He spent his entire life living much the way he had as a child, but without the fear and the deprivation. He had enough food, but he ate very simple food. He dressed in simple clothes. He lived in a tent throughout his whole life. He never lived in a palace or even in a city. So in this regard, I think he's the true exception. And I think that early in his life, you can see how he's taking this suffering the same way many of us would. He just wants revenge against someone, or he wants to escape from someone, or he wants to get his wife back. But very slowly in his life, as he matures, he sees that these are only temporary solutions, that the final solution has to come in a much different way. In this regard, I think that Genghis Khan among world leaders is at least unusual, if not unique.
What
Yes,
do
sir.
you know about where he died, when, and under what circumstances?
As we know some things about his death, he died in 1227 in what is now the north of China, not too far from the Yellow River. It was on a campaign against a people that they called then the Tangut, or a kingdom called Shishia. He was on a campaign against them. He died in the field. It's not exactly sure how. He had fallen during a hunt some months before, and it could be that it was an after effect or some kind of lingering problem that had set in during this fall. He was with one of his wives. He eventually had 4 wives. It was not Berta, his original wife. I'm almost certain that she was dead at this point in his life. But he was with another wife. She, as often happened in the Mongol family, the wife would take over when the man was away with the animals. And she then helped to administer a transition. And it's said that he died in August. And some people think they know the exact date, and you get different details from Marco Polo and other people. For the most part, the Mongols kept it very quiet until their victory over the Tangut people had been assured. And then sometime during this period, he was transported then back to Mongolia for a secret burial. Everything was kept very quiet, but he lived to a reasonable old age, especially for that time. It was quite an old age. Yes, ma'am.
You spoke about Mongolia opening up, what was it, in the 1980s or so? And
1990, yes.
Yeah, simultaneously a history of the Mongol people
yes.
was...
Yes.
How did that come
Yes.
about?
That's a scholarly story. Of course, that's the kind of thing I love so much. So I have to try to be brief. Otherwise, I would go on all night. But I had mentioned that Genghis Khan didn't allow anything to be written in his own lifetime. However, when he died, the whole family gathered to elect a successor because he had also created a law that the successor had to be elected. He said that even he himself could not appoint a successor. Even though he preferred one of his sons, he could not do it. They had to be elected. So during this process, someone wrote down the history of the family. Now, this document, for a long time it was thought the document didn't exist because no copy could be found. It was written by someone who was quite intimate into the family, and I think actually that it's a man I've already mentioned who was an adopted Tatar who became the Supreme Court justice because he was the first one who could read and write among the Mongols. But the stories that he wrote down, it's not a history of the conquests of the world. No, the conquests take up almost no space at all. It's just a couple of them are mentioned. Most of the kingdoms are even left off. It's all the story about all those stories. It's almost like everyone gathering for Thanksgiving dinner and the stories that you hear year after year. There's great detail in them. There's a little bit of humor, some sadness. They always have a good point. You can't take everything completely at face value, but nevertheless, it's full of information. A lot of which was not positive about Genghis Khan, in the sense it's not what you want a great conqueror to be. It talks about that he was afraid of dogs, for example. It talked about the times that he cried. He cried when his father died and they were deserted. And he was a boy of 8, and he was the oldest son, and he couldn't do anything, and he cried. That's a real weakness in the eyes of a great conqueror. So all these stories are there. The stories about Berta, his wife, and about his mother, that he was very indecisive about many things growing up. And it was always either his mother or his wife who made the crucial decisions. They always stepped in and said, this is what you should do. And so he was a man who was governed very much by the women early in his life. And this didn't sit too well with many subjects. So this whole document was a secret document, and so it became known as the secret history of the Mongols. And after a while, it was thought that it did not exist. But it showed up in this coded copy in the 19th century. And it's a very complex code because it was actually written using Chinese characters to represent Mongolian sounds of the 13th century. And so it took a while to crack it. There's still a few arguments, but fortunately, now we have 3 very good translations, or I'm going to even say decipherings of it, into English. One by an Australian scholar, an American scholar, and a Mongolian scholar. Yes, sir.
How did this huge, diverse society survive with a very small army and no repression of people? You have something that stands all over the entire world at that time, and yet he only has 100,000 more people.
Well, on the repression, I should say at the very beginning, the Mongol might was tremendous, and it came down like a hammer on cities that rebelled. So in the very early years, they did destroy a number of cities that rebelled against them. However, almost immediately after Genghis Khan was dead, it was very hard for the army just by force to impose its will. And so I think it was simply from the fact that everyone was benefiting. The people in Persia were getting goods out of China they had never seen before. The people in China were getting steel out of Damascus. They were getting glass out of the West when they didn't have the technology for glass. The West was getting silk, which they already had in some quantities, but not very large quantities. They were getting porcelain. They were getting new foods, new medicines. Kublai Khan created a Western hospital, Western in their sense meaning Muslim, but Western hospital in Beijing. They created what we might call today a university in modern Persia based on Chinese knowledge with pharmacy and acupuncture. So the world was benefiting. Everybody recognized it was a global awakening. It's the only thing I know to call it. The world was recognizing all these benefits. So it was a wonderful empire for a very short period of time. And then it ended when the plague came. The great empire that brought everybody in contact also brought the plague into contact with everyone. The empire fell apart. Yes, sir.
What were the elements of Mongolian mythology / religion that made Genghis Khan who he was?
Genghis Khan went to that mountain when he fled. He went to that mountain and he went to the top of the tallest mountain in the area and he prayed to the eternal blue sky. And that's where his entire life was spent, going to the mountaintop and praying to the eternal blue sky. That was his God. That was his spiritual force in life. And he clung to that tenaciously. And I believe that that is where he is now, there.
Time for one more question.
One more question. Yes, please.
Could you tell us how it is that you came to write the book? And then also a little bit about Mongolia. Is it possible, are there tourist facilities? Can one go to Mongolia today?
Ah, yes. How I came to write the book, I really was not, I had no intention of writing this book. This is not a book I set out to write. It's a book that came to me. It's a part of research on tribal people in Central Asia and their role in the commercial routes of the Silk Route. And it just slowly became more and more apparent to me and increasingly important that it was not just tribal people, but one tribe in particular, the Mongols, and not just anyone but Genghis Khan himself, who had the greatest part of this story, that was the story that was important to tell. So the book kind of forced itself on me. I had never written a biography. It wasn't my intention to do so, but it came about in that way. As far as the tourism in Mongolia, I would urge everyone to go to Mongolia. Mongolia is the most beautiful country in the world. You can stand in Mongolia and you can go, walk, ride a horse, a four-wheel drive, a camel. 1,000 miles in every direction, and never hit a fence, never have to cross a paved road, never hit any impediment. The country is just as open today as in the time of Genghis Khan. It's there to be appreciated. The animals are there by the millions. The milk flows throughout the late summer in particular. There's always food in Mongolia, good fresh food from the animals that they raise there. And the people are the most hospitable people you will ever find anywhere in the world. Mongolia is a treasure, unlike any treasure that you can imagine. There is no place left in the world. And in the end, I think that's perhaps the best place to conclude all the comments, because if there is a great contribution of Genghis Khan, aside from what he did for the world, aside from what he did for law, aside from what he did for military strategy, what he did for commerce, it's that he preserved his home country from all of the other people who wanted to invade it. And Mongolia today is still as he left it. It awaits your arrival.
Thank you all for coming out tonight, and a special thank you to Jack Weatherford for being here this evening. And as you can tell with the cameras, we have a special taping tonight for C-SPAN's Book TV. So we will run this as we usually do. Jack will speak for about 20 minutes to a half an hour, and then he'll take your questions. And then if you want your book signed, we'll take care of all that after the question and answers. And my name's Kim, and I am the events coordinator here at Bound to Be Read. So I will do a little introduction for Jack, and then we will let him come up here. So Professor Weatherford is a cultural anthropologist who has been teaching anthropology at Macalester College since 1983. He graduated from the University of South Carolina with a BA in political science and received an MA in sociology from the University of South Carolina also. Soon after, he went back for an MA in anthropology. In 1977, he received his PhD in anthropology from the University of California, in San Diego. He further went on to get a postdoctoral degree in policy studies from Duke University Institute of Policy Sciences. Since then, Dr. Weatherford has worked with contemporary groups in places such as Bolivia and the Amazon. He's also worked with historical analyses such as the impact of the American Indians on world history. In recent years, he has concentrated on the Mongols by looking at their impact since the time that Genghis Khan...
Darkness, they left her and her 8 children to die. It's from this beginning that our story originates, because this woman, Oylun, the woman who was taken against her will to live in this place by a man who had kidnapped her and then died, this woman ran up and down the river, as the story says, night and day. She pulled her hat down on her head, she tied up her skirt, she took a juniper stick, and she ran up and down the river in order to dig roots, in order to find something to fill, in the words of the ancient poets, to fill the gullet of her brood. And she did it, somehow against all odds, against every imaginable odd. She managed to survive, and she protected every one of her children, and they survived. This boy, Temüjin, was going to grow up to become Genghis Khan. He had a life not just of poverty, not just in a remote place, but as an outcast, an absolute outcast from everyone and everything. And soon after the survival of these children, he was taken as a slave by another tribe. And from this position of outcast and then slave, he slowly began to assemble a life for himself. It's very hard to imagine what kind of life he was going to assemble. But there was a girl whom he met, a young girl, and in the Mongolian tradition, as often happened, just slightly older than he was. Her name was Berta. He met her, and it said that from the beginning that there was fire in her eyes and light in her face, and that he fell in love with her. And as a teenager, she came to live with him, probably around 16 years old or so. He would have been around 16, I imagine, and she was probably around 17 years old. She came to live with him. And you can just imagine, perhaps, in this lonely, lonely place, somebody who has never had a life, somebody who has lived as an outcast and a slave, never had anything good in this world, the poorest of the poor. They ate whatever scraps of food they could find, and now he has something good in his life. One good thing, Berta. She loves him, he loves her, and after only a few months, she is kidnapped away from him. A tribe comes. They're all sleeping in the tent in the ger early in the morning, and there were several people in the family. There were the boys, there was one young daughter, there was the mother, there was another woman who had taken refuge with the family. This little family of outcasts. They were sleeping, as sometimes happens. Some of the older people are half awake, half asleep, and this older woman, they called her grandmother Coaction, she was half asleep and half awake, lying on the floor, and she felt the vibrations. She felt somewhere, as it said, she had ears like a weasel, and she felt the vibrations in the earth, and she warned them that someone was coming. They fled. They fled, and of course they had to leave her behind, because Berta was the prize that the attackers were seeking. And Erlund, the mother who had pulled these children through so much, she knew what she had to do to save her children, and that is she had to leave this other younger woman behind, and she did it. So here's Temüjin now. He's had a horrible life up to this age of 16 or so. Something good happens for a short period of time, and now who will he be? What will he be? Will he fight? Higher altitude. What I'd like to do tonight, though, is begin our story. It's a long time ago. It's 800 years ago. It's way back in the 1100s. It was a much different place in the world, especially in Central Asia. And to begin the story in a very remote place, even within Central Asia, even within Mongolia, a very remote place. It's a small river, the Onan River, that flows out of Mongolia into Siberia. It's a river where not much has happened in the history of the world. But back at this particular time, it was a springtime, back around the year 1170 or so, a woman was left alone. A woman who had 5 children, a woman who had been kidnapped, who had been taken against her will. She was left alone because the tribe no longer had food to feed her. They no longer had a means to take care of her. And her eldest son at this time was 8 years old. He was going to become Genghis Khan. At this time, he was just a young boy, Temüjin, just a young kid, an 8-year-old. And suddenly to have in your life something occur that's so traumatic, to have your entire family thrown out to die. The clan could not support her because her husband was dead. No other man would marry her. And the tribe had to move on. As the tribe left her behind, she grabbed up the emblem of her husband. It's a stick that had the horse hair tied onto it from all of the horses that he had ever had in his life. And in Mongolian history, this was the banner of that man. This was his soul after he died. She grabbed it up and she raced after the people, and she raced around them, and she so shamed them that they returned only until dark. And then in the cover of dark,
united the Mongol tribes in 1206. The result being his new book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Professor Weatherford has also appeared on radio and television programs including The Today Show, ABC Evening News with Peter Jennings, Larry King, All Things Considered, and The Voice of America, as well as international programs from Bolivia to Mongolia. He is the author of several books, including The History of Money, Savages and Civilization, Who Will Survive, which is on the contemporary clash of world cultures, Indian Givers, How the Indians of the Americas Transformed the World, and Native Roots, How the Indians Enriched America. Dr. Weatherford's books have won the Minnesota Book Award in 1989 and 1992. He also received the 1992 Anthropology in the Media Award from the American Anthropological Association, and he received the 1994 Mass Media Award of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Please welcome Professor Jack Weatherford. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kim. I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone coming out tonight here in beautiful St. Paul, Minnesota, to talk about a place that's very, very far away and yet in some ways quite similar to here. We're all familiar with cold in Minnesota, and Mongolia is the home of cold. I think it's sort of like Minnesota, except at a much higher